So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the Data Provider webinar. We're really glad that you have managed to join. And essentially, this is a session that is an update for you, our data providers and partners on the HE2AT Center project. We're joined today as well by myself, Natasha Lalou, one of the researchers at the HE2AT Center, as well as my colleagues who are also researchers and primary investigators on the HE2AT Center project. We're going to explain to you how we have used your data and how we are caring for your data as we move on to the end stages of the main HE2AT Center project and we transition data storage to the cloud. We will explain what's changing, what stays the same, how you approve migration, and how your data agreements are protected. Just an overview of today, we're going to cover dataset acquisition and harmonization, current and upcoming outputs, then the part which is most relevant to you, which is data management, access, and storage. We'll also go over the center's future vision and plans, and finally a question and answer session, which gives you an opportunity to ask us a few questions and have a discussion with the team. Today's session will be recorded and it will also be shared afterwards, and you are welcome to share that with colleagues whom you know may be missing from this session in case they couldn't make it. And just a few housekeeping notes as we go along. As I've mentioned before, please keep your mics off and we will turn them on later when we have the Q&A session. And yeah, I hope this is helpful and relevant. I'll now hand over to my colleague Dashnika, who will take us through an introduction.
And thank you, Natasha. So I'm just going to talk you through very briefly a reminder about the study rationale and aims of the HE2AT Center. Next slide, please. So it's been established that heat poses a risk to pregnant women and infants. There are a number of factors such as anatomical, physiological, biological, cultural, and behavioral factors that make this population particularly vulnerable to heat. While these impacts are being increasingly measured in the global north, we know less about the impacts in Africa, which is some of the questions that we aim to answer in our research project 1. We also know that urbanization is rapidly occurring in African cities, and with the built environment, there's increased absorption and generation of heat, in and amongst other factors, that results in the temperature being hotter in cities as compared to surrounding areas. The term that we use for this is urban heat islands. And this is especially true for urban populations living in densely populated areas with very minimal vegetation. So this image, for example, in the middle is quite a famous image taken in Johannesburg of the stark differences between Sandton, which is sometimes known as the Golden Mile in Africa, as compared to Alex, which is a neighboring informal settlement. And you can see clearly the stark differences there, including in the temperature. So we aim to explore this vulnerability in our research project 2. And lastly, we know that there is an increasing acknowledgement of the impacts of heat on health, but we need the data that's going to drive the solutions to mitigate the impacts, such as data that is going to feed into early warning systems, as well as indicates development for surveillance. And that's what we hope to achieve in the HE2AT Center. Next slide, please. So just to quickly take you through the 4 main aims of the HE2AT Center. So aim number 1 is to prepare a data science ecosystem that enables the reuse of existing health data, the data that you've shared with us, and environmental and climate data, and it serves as a platform for innovative data science analysis. Then the second aim is to increase knowledge and develop novel solutions. The third aim is to advance capacity for the application of data science, especially focusing on early career researchers. And the fourth is to serve as a center of excellence to inform policy and practice. Next slide, please. So this map represents the distribution of our partners and our collaborators in the HE2AT Center. And just to acknowledge that this has grown over the duration of our project, where we've added on and financed some small pilot projects, as well as supplementary projects like CHEAQI, which is characterizing the impacts of air quality on maternal, neonatal, and child health project, and HarmonAIze project, which my colleague Natasha will speak about soon. So we've just been growing our network, and you can see that spans across Southern Africa, West Africa, East Africa, and the USA. The next slide, please. This is just a slide showing some of the pictures representing some of our meetings, presentations, and workshops over the last 5 years, and some of the many faces behind the work that we've been doing. So I'm now going to be handing over to Shonan, who will take you through the data acquisition process. Thank you.
Thank you, Dashnika. Afternoon, everyone. My name is Shelleen, a researcher and PhD candidate at HE²AT Zimbabwe. And myself and my colleague Natasha are going to take you through the dataset acquisition, harmonization of the data that you have shared with us. Next slide, please. So as Dashnika mentioned, we have Research Project 1, where we're looking at the effects of heat on maternal and child health outcomes. So what we did was to go through a systematic mapping of all sub-Saharan African pregnancy cohorts and trials, and we were able to identify 223 eligible cohorts, and we have invited the data providers, including yourselves, to this. And in Research Project 2, where we're looking at the urban heat island effect, we systematically mapped cohorts and trials that we carried out in Johannesburg, South Africa, and Abidjan in Ivory Coast. We identified 78 eligible studies, and we invited data providers to this process. Next slide, please. So in total, we are following up 301 studies that are eligible. And so far, we have 163 of these data sets that are currently in the pipeline. 138 either did not have access to the data due to institutional transfers, or they were ineligible once we got the study protocols, or they declined because they were doing similar research work. And the breakdown of these 163 that are currently in the pipeline, we have secured 70 of these, and they are in different stages of harmonization and transformation in order to get to the analysis stage. Currently, we're in discussions with 58 data providers, 22 where we're still signing the data sharing agreement, which I'm sure you have seen during these procedures. And currently, we have 40 merged data sets that we are currently analyzing. I will now hand over to Natasha, who's going to take us through the harmonization process.
Thank you, Sherlyn. So here we have an overview of the main stages of data use post-acquisition. The first stage of data processing was ingestion, where data was taken onto the UCT cluster through a secure transfer mechanism, and it was then stored on an access-controlled server at UCT. The tables were changed to a CSV format, and the data was rechecked for eligibility. Minimal processing at this stage included hashing the participant ID using a random salt function, which creates a secure random participant ID to hide the participant's identification. This processing step also extracted the study codebook information, for example, variable name meanings and definitions where available, and generated synthetic data for each available variable. The next step in this pipeline was harmonization, which is a critical step in how we turn many different study datasets into one consistent analysis-ready resource where the variables mean the same thing across different studies. We then conducted geocoding and linked exposure variables. We are currently completing the phase of creating an analysis-ready dataset that can be used with a federated analysis platform. I'll walk you through some of these details now. In short, the target codebook was designed to capture key variables from studies that would be used for planned analyses in order to meet our HE²AT Center project objectives. Target variables had specific definitions, and these were derived from cataloged ontologies such as NCIT and SNOMED, similar to the ICD-10 codes which many of you may be familiar with. We specified the units, categories, and variable types for consistency. This formed the basis to which all datasets that we received were harmonized. We used a combination of resources received from you, such as study codebooks, case report forms, publications, and study protocols, in order to first understand the study and the data, and then to understand the variables which guided our harmonization efforts. First stage of harmonization, or at least the first batch of harmonization, was performed using a mapping tool that was developed by the UCT CSAG team. I'm sorry that this is a slightly low resolution screenshot, but essentially it captures the various items that we used within this tool to actually harmonize your variables within each table and within each study. The system of mapping, or at least the term mapping, refers to a process where we relate the study variable received from you to the target variable in the codebook, in our master codebook. And this also involved determining how it needs to be formatted or processed. For example, if we have a variable that's in kilograms, but in the codebook it's grams, we would need to know that this variable needs to be multiplied by 1,000 to change that format or change that unit. It's also included things such as recategorizing to conform to the target categories. The Heatmapper tool reads in the study variable names and the synthetic data attached to each study variable. This is where AI assistance came in, where a large language model based on embeddings read in this information and generated suggested variable matches to what was in the Heat target codebook in terms of the variable definitions and the names of the variables. And it also attached a confidence level to each of these suggestions. This guided harmonization efforts as well, and was especially useful for any of those harmonizing who were not clinicians or had no biomedical background. This is an example of the harmonized final data set. It is in a long format, which captures the longitudinal nature of some of the variables, such as malaria or repeated weight or mid-upper arm circumference measurements. As you can see, the original participant IDs are hashed, and the location names are also coded so that the actual locations of each participant site is held separately and securely from the data that is being analyzed, and this further preserves privacy. Once we completed harmonization, location data was geocoded. This process involved taking facility, study site, hometown, suburb, or village names, or in some very rare instances, addresses. And we managed to create geolocations out of these, for example, latitude and longitude coordinates or regional shapes or vectors. This was done through sophisticated geocoding techniques, including using existing databases of healthcare facilities in each country, fuzzy matching of names, and validation of the points we had come to through processes such as reverse geocoding, source proximity, and degree of urbanization. Once the study locations were resolved, exposure variables such as ambient temperature were linked to the health data using these locations and infant birth dates. This is essentially the final data set that was used for analysis, where we have health data and our linked exposure data, which was done via geolocation. Over the course of 2024 and 2025, we successfully harmonized 18 datasets using the original Heatmapper tool that I just showed you. We thereafter performed quality checks on the harmonized variables to assess whether or not they actually harmonized accurately. And we found that due to some human error and a few limitations of the mapping tool, we had to rectify some of this harmonization. This ultimately led us to conducting a manual process of harmonization during an intensive 1-week-long in-person workshop, where we pushed to harmonize a further 10 datasets. This is overall a very intensive process and takes quite a lot of time, skills, and resources. This is why we are developing or have almost completed the development of an open source toolkit called HarmonAIze, which is an innovative data harmonization tool leveraging large language models and retrieval augmented generation to ingest codebooks and related study material to significantly reduce the time that is taken to harmonize studies and to even conduct geocoding and exposure linkage quickly. The toolkit generally is functional already, can be deployed locally, and is undergoing development to be deployed on a cloud, which we are hoping will be available to everyone in the coming few weeks. We intend to use this toolkit to harmonize remaining studies. And for those with any confidentiality concerns, it's important to note that actual health data is not uploaded to any cloud or AI in this toolkit. Rather, the synthetic data is generally what is utilized. And optionally, if one were to use this toolkit, both the actual and synthetic data can be loaded into it. So that's that on harmonization. I hope that helped you understand how we are using your data. And I would now like to hand over to my colleague Tatenda, who will take us through some of the current and upcoming outputs in Research Project 1.
Thank you, Natasha. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are. My name is Tatenda Makanga. I'm a research scientist with SESHA in Zimbabwe, one of the HE² Center partners. So this section is about what the HE² Center RP1 platform is starting to produce. You'll see that we're moving beyond just data acquisition and harmonization into results, manuscripts, indicators, and tools. So I'll focus first on heat and preterm birth, the findings as it relates to preterm births, and then briefly cover wider publication pipelines and the policy-facing outputs that we're building from the analysis. And I'll focus specifically on Research Project 1, and my colleague will then present on Research Project 2. Next slide. So maybe just a brief background. The objective of this work was to test whether short-term exposure to extreme heat increases the risk of preterm birth. For the preterm birth was our outcome, and our exposure of interest was UTCI, which is an acronym for the Universal Thermal Climate Index. And this is a comfort index that reflects not only temperature, but also humidity, wind, and solar radiation. The analysis draws from 11 studies and about 10,000 recorded preterm births. In terms of methods, we used a case crossover design where each woman acts as their own control and added a distributed leg model to look at timing and potential impact of timing of exposure on the outcome. Our comparison was the 75th percentile against the 99th percentile for the UTCI exposure. As you can see in the figures, the main pooled estimate points outwards, so the pooled estimate of the impact of extreme heat on outcomes, and extreme heat was associated with about 28% higher odds of preterm birth. That's within the 11 studies that I've mentioned. This result still needs cautious interpretation because the overall pooled estimate is not definitive, but the direction of the effect is still important. Now, the curve on the right also suggests that risk is fairly flat at the lower UTCI levels and then rises more sharply under extreme heat conditions. Could you move to the next slide, which is related to this slide? So the objective of this slide and this part of the study was to understand when heat effect is strongest. So when does exposure matter the most? In simple terms, we asked whether heat matters the most on the day of delivery or in the few days before delivery. So you'll see from the leg-specific sensitivity analysis that acute windows seem most important. So heat on the day of delivery, which is leg 0, was associated with about 22% higher odds of preterm birth. And this is a significant finding for that particular day. When we include the day of delivery plus the previous day, the odds were about 29%. And then when we include the day of delivery plus the previous 2 days, so to the third day before delivery, the odds were about 28% higher. So the strongest and most statistically significant signal is within the immediate 1 to 3 days prior to birth, which seems to suggest the acute effect of extreme heat on triggering a preterm birth. As the leg windows become wider, leg 3 going backwards, so 3 days before delivery going backwards, the effect estimates remain positive, but they become less precise or less significant. And this tells us the public health message may be less about average weekly heat and more about short-term bursts in extreme heat immediately before preterm delivery. Thank you. Next slide. The objective of this sub-study was to examine whether temperature is linked to hypertensive disorders of pregnancy. So looking at a different outcome now, and more a chronic exposure. And we're particularly interested in seeing if heat exposure early on in pregnancy is an important exposure window. So this analysis uses the precise cohort of about 7,000 women from the Gambia, Kenya, and Mozambique. And out of the 7,000, we singled out 5,455 pregnant women who met the inclusion criteria for this portion of the study. The key result is straightforward. So you would see in the green box there that each degree increase in first trimester temperature was associated with about 10% higher odds in hypertension in pregnancy, after adjusting for key maternal and contextual factors. So alongside preterm birth, we are also seeing a heat signal for maternal vascular outcomes early in pregnancy. Next slide. So I've singled out those two examples of our early analysis, but we've also managed to push out several publications and other means of communicating the outcomes of our study. And this slide just gives you a quick snapshot of what the platform is producing. The outputs include manuscripts, harmonization tools, exposure assignment tools, and policy-facing products. Next slide. In terms of upcoming outputs, the work falls into a few clear themes. One is prediction, including machine learning for preterm birth using multiple environmental exposures. Another is heat and pregnancy outcomes, including birth weight, stillbirth, and acute heat effects. The third is layering air quality, especially PM2.5, and its effect on preterm birth, and how there are geographic differences in the interaction between PM2.5 and temperature. Next slide. This is my final slide about turning evidence into impact. The map shows how model results can become spatial indicators. For example, estimating preterm birth that is attributable to heat in different places. That's the direction of travel, not only papers, but tools for policy, planning, and intervention. These indicators can help show where risk is highest, track changes over time, assess where the interventions are working, and communicate the health and economic burden of heat exposure. I'll hand you over to my colleague, Galadio, who will speak to Research Project 2. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. So RP2 has also, as presented earlier, a component of gathering data after the systematic review and applying data science innovative tools to better understand the links between the heterogeneity in the city and the heat and the health. And I'm highlighting which is about urban climate adaptation, heat health, understanding in urban contexts, and how we can reach some early warning systems that take into account the heterogeneity in the city. So I will highlight a few results from urban heat exposure and health. And one important component of it also is what we did as efforts or the achievements with regard to training and engagement. Next slide. First, we had to refer to international frameworks that link vulnerability, exposure, and hazards, and then the differences in the context. As you will see, the differences that we could follow it in Johannesburg and Abidjan. Next slide. So here in Johannesburg, the study looked at two neighboring wards, one having green areas, and having a kind of well situation compared to another one that is somehow less privileged and having less greens in that area. So the findings show that vulnerability separates Alexandra from Stanton. The aperture area planning still shapes exposure, and the main drivers are high LST, low greenness, no medical insurance cover, hunger, and the paper is about it. It has been published about it. Next slide. In Abidjan, we also worked on underprivileged areas. We succeeded to make a mapping of where the heat islands are occurring. And the main findings is that the highest vulnerability is in the port areas, particularly 3 settlements are highlighted there, Orboet, Trècheville, and Kumasi. And the informal settlements in Abidjan were also among the most vulnerable. And we are showing in the next slides how we went on undertaking an early warning system in those areas. Besides and beyond having the data from the data providers, as RP1 has done, we have on-ground activities, surveys, household surveys, and we deployed sensors in some households, in some streets. We combined trying to understand how heat and air pollution overlap in the concrete real-life situations. Next slide. Here, we just highlight a few results. On the graph on the left side, it's a pilot project we conducted on social media, particularly from Facebook, where we can see that the signals coming for those messages were following the heat temperature records also in the same areas. And the other, highlights are showing some papers on perceptions, people's perception as well as of heat in Africa, systematic review, and also some preliminary results from the air pollution in the city of Abidjan. Next slide. So there's a number of papers in the pipeline about the causal link between air pollution and temperature related to heat waves, impacts on conditions of water, access to water, hygiene, sanitation. The foundational model approach for estimating land surface temperature in areas across the globe, health impacts of extreme heat events in disadvantaged urban communities across Africa, investigation into ambient temperature and daytime sleepiness, and the spatial thermodynamics of land use and the island in Abidjan. And then characterization of heat waves also in Abidjan. Next. So the work on these concrete spaces led us to have from the start a strong component of training and stakeholder engagement. This is images of an annual workshop where we have the chance to have panels with policymakers, community members from those settlements. Next. And here we have also some stakeholder engagement with even regional or international bodies like WHO, Peace in Africa, where some roundtable has been organized around the heat wave and health in Côte d'Ivoire. Also having on the table people from the Ministry of Health, some other important authorities. Next. So then we come to the early warning system. We decided to test a pilot an early warning system in the poor settlement of Williamsville, how we can send alerts to residents via schools, clinics, and community representative scaling Abidjan-wide. Next. So it's a long process, but from the start, it is not intended to have only papers or publications, but to really have a component of capacity building with 6 PhD students, 3 postdocs, but also engaging with policymakers, responsible authorities to end up with an early warning system that is piloted in the settlements, and also evaluating, sending students to evaluate what the efficiency of that process. Next. So here you have only an image of the steering committee composed of health authorities shared by the director, one director of the Ministry of Health. Next. So that's it. I think the idea is to show that the data providers, the data we are getting from providers is coming to be in synergy with some other important activities that we are doing on the ground with stakeholders and building capacities. I'm handing over to my next colleague.
Good afternoon to everybody joining on the course. My name is Busisiwe Makanya, and I'm from IBM Research and part of the HE2AT Center consortium. What I will be taking you through today is some of the needs and consideration when it comes to long-term storage and protection of the data that is being used to answer some of the questions that we have coming up as part of the activities of the HE2AT Center. I think what is important for you to keep in mind is essentially there isn't changes in terms of the security aspects or how the data is protected and used within the HE2AT Center, nor are there material changes in terms of the standing legal agreements, but there is a change in terms of the stewardship of the data itself. And so that's what I hope to elucidate in this section of the talk. Next slide. So essentially, when we first started out, the data management and analysis core, the platform for storing the data, was hosted by the University of Cape Town's Climate System and Analysis Group through some of their servers. And as we thought about the long-term sustainability of the project and the need to accommodate efficiency in terms of federated analyses, we made a decision as a consortium that migrating to a cloud-based solutions would serve best the needs of the consortium. And so the move was to the Microsoft Azure cloud platform that would be managed by Wits Health Consortium. So in terms of where is the data actually hosted, so it is hosted in data centers within South Africa. So essentially the data stays in South Africa. There isn't a change in terms of that. The ethical and legal frameworks that we've had from the beginning of the project formulated and developed for this project, those essentially also remain unchanged. What was critical for us was also just making sure that the data is protected at every step of the process, which is why we were motivated to go with the Databricks data management as a solution, specifically the medallion architecture, which ensures that we have different levels of security in terms of what form of data different individuals with different needs are able to access within the consortium itself. Just as an example, as you saw earlier, there are 4 teams that are dealing with raw data, so receiving this data and ensure that's stored correctly for the needs of the center. So those individuals would have bronze layer access in terms of access classification. But we do have a lot of activities within the HE2AT Center, those that are looking to do various types of analyses. There's a process for that within the HE2AT Center, getting approval to proceed with the intended analyses. But in terms of access, for example, those individuals will be able to be granted access as through the gold restricted layer, where we have our analysis ready data, which means it has been pre-processed in terms of anonymization. It has been harmonized, geocoded, and essentially ready for the analyses to be done. And then the second gold layer, so as to say, or the top layer, is more aspirational on the side of the HE2AT Center, as we are processing data through to address the various questions that are coming up in our work. We are producing data as a byproduct. And so there is the element of we will be producing inferential data, which means it's data that is not able to identify individual participants. It's aggregated layer, and it's data that potentially we can then make available for others that have questions from a climate and health perspective. So essentially, the whole plan around migrating data, it's more about the long-term solution for hosting or keeping the data within the HE2AT Center. Next slide, please. One of the first steps in terms of engaging with you around this whole data migration process is to receive your consent to approve the migration. Essentially, you will be contacted by members of the team where they will share a form with you, where you will then identify your data sets and essentially give consent to migrate. The migration itself, we've planned for this to be secure, so applying the relevant encryption keys that apply to sensitive data specifically, and also ensuring that we are POPIA compliant, complying with the Protection of Personal Information Act, which is an important, or the applicable data privacy law in South Africa. Next slide. Then there's the element around agreements. So there are agreements that are already in place. So initially we had the agreements with the University of Cape Town, so that those agreements would be migrated or carried over to WITS Health Consortium, essentially unchanged. So same terms, it's just to accommodate the change in stewardship that we have this process going on. As data providers, you will not be directly involved, and if you are, it will be a simple process of giving approval. It will essentially be done between the two institutions, QCT and Health. Next slide. And then the other process that requires your involvement has to do with post-project data governance and future use confirmation. It is valuable information that has been collected through the HE²AT Center, and we do foresee that beyond the current project term or what you have signed in terms of your data transfer agreements, which was the effective term ending 30 June today, essentially, we would like to request your consent to extend this further to a period beyond today to allow analyses that are currently ongoing and those in the future that would come up as people naturally come up with questions around heat and health. Next slide. So what we're asking of you today, we do have legal representatives on the call. Please pose questions that you have, whether it's the consent with regards to the consent to migration, or if it's with regards to the post-project data governance. Please raise questions that you may have so that they'll be able to address that. The process has been designed to make sure that in the completion of both forms will be efficient on your side, and so we're not foreseeing that this will be difficult for you to complete, but there may be questions that you need to be addressed, and so the legal team and the team post this webinar will also be available to answer any questions that may come up for you. And I want to thank you. I want to pass it over to Matthew to talk about the vision and future plans for the center.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone. Firstly, to thank the previous presenters. The HE² Center has developed this incredible group of early and mid-career researchers over the last 5 years. Have really all grown and have learned so much in this process. So I think the future vision is really this. There's a safe number of people in hand able to take this forward. In terms of the future vision, I think we really want to move beyond the harmonization and the legal stages. You may not believe it, but it's 5 years of hard work from a large team to get us to this point, going through the tools and the legal processes and then the data storage. And at each stage was very careful processes, the ethics and the legal. So at this point, I think we are ready now to really, the presenters noted, to move beyond harmonization, beyond the legal processes. We've set up this new cloud, and we're really in a place now where we can move forward to the exciting parts of this, where some students will finish their PhDs and masters, and we can do some really interesting analysis. Maybe just in terms of the project, to note, we do have a 1-year no-cost extension from the NIH, so we have at least a year funding, not a funding, a no-cost extension to continue the project. It was meant to be a 10-year project, but I'm sure you're all aware of the reasons the 5-year extension wasn't granted. But we have additional project that came on the back of the HE² Center, which will provide funding to continue this work. And that's from the Wellcome Trust in Southern Africa, Consortium for Climate Change Health. The other, I think, key area to mention is what was already raised is the use of this data that's really guiding the global and Africa process on indicators. So heat and preterm birth really seems to be an indicator that is able to measure the impacts of heat and of climate change on health. You measure the impacts of heat through mortality and through other measures, but really heat and preterm birth, we believe, based on HE²AT Center and on other findings from systematic reviews, etc., is really key indicator. Gladio, Daphnica, have been selected to run the Lancet Africa Countdown Working Group 1, which looks at impact indicators, and especially around preterm birth. And we're trying to mainstream that into the global Lancet Countdown, and also preterm birth is heat being a WHO indicator for climate change and health measuring impact. So that's really a future area. The HE² Center will really, I think, make its mark on global indicators. There's also additional consortium similar to HE² Center. It's called the CRISP Consortium. There's an Africa Center is making a new consortium. So there are other ways of getting Africa data into these global consortium. And HE² Center is really a key database. Very few other African data that's well curated and that's high quality that can assess the impacts of heat on maternal and child health outcomes. So in terms of global impact, this is a key data, a key future area. And of course, like Gladio mentioned, in Johannesburg and Abidjan, a future application will be an early warning system, which will develop in both of those places. And maybe finally to mention, we're really open to concepts and to ideas from data providers and from our group. How do we maximize this work we put in, but more importantly, that you put in over decades in many instances to develop your data and to collect and provide and very kindly share your data with us. So we're really open to new ideas and ways to maximize this database that we've developed with your kind sharing of data over the last 5 years. And I think maybe just to mention, there's this optional onward sharing where that the data then might be used for other purposes and other scientists across the continent. But as we noted, that's optional. We've got we've got a very large future ahead of us within the HE² Center and with our data providers as we are. But yeah, I think the future's bright and there's a lot we can do with what we have done. And again, congratulations to the early and mid-career researchers for the hard work we've done. They've done makes our job, my job, much easier. They've done tremendous work. So congratulations, everyone. Excellent. And of course, the funding is through Brad Newsom and others at NIH, through our partners across Africa. It's really been a tremendous group. I saw a comment in the chat noting the way our team has handed over to each speaker. I think there's this close-knit community we have developed over the last 5 years amongst the partners. So I'm grateful to all of them and the data providers. Excellent. I think we can open for questions and so on. Back to you, Natasha.
Thank you so much, Matthew. And thank you to all the presenters that went really well. You all presented the really interesting work and have done it justice. We now move on to the question and answer session. We have about 8 minutes left of the time slot. However, if anyone has any burning questions beyond that, please also send us an email. I will put up a slide that has any contact details and a few other resources that you may access. Yeah, please put up your hand. I see already we have a hand. Deborah, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, hi everyone. Really exciting work. Thank you so much. You guys have really done great. And actually, Mark's on the call, I see as well. If we have ideas for analysis, who should we contact? I'm not going to do it myself, but I think there's some stuff that Mark and I have and the data sets that we've contributed that we think might be good questions. And I'm retiring, so I just want to help. I don't want to paid, but I do think there's some good questions. And so who do we contact? Maybe to find a student or somebody on the team who's interested that we can mentor or work with to look at some questions like maybe around breastfeeding or other kinds of things. Thanks.
Natasha or Daphnica, do you want to take that?
Sure, I can take that question. Thanks, Deborah. So I think you've seen a couple of our planned analyses as well. So we are planning on broadening some of the outcomes that we are hoping to look at, and we have a few people dedicated to that work. But if you can just pop me an email, then I can refer it to the right people, see if there's available resources for it, or else if you know of a student that's interested in doing a specific analysis, then you can apply through a data governance committee to then access the data and make that available for your student to conduct that analysis. So I think those would be the two available avenues. But yeah, if you just pop me an email, I think my email address is on the slide, and then I can direct it accordingly.
Thank you, Gareth. There's always appetite for new and interesting work. So I think it would be it would not be too hard to find somebody who would be keen to take up a few things. I will also pop those email addresses in the chat so that people can copy it. Do we have any other questions? I see Francois Fintel has posted a very similar comment, actually. Is there anything you would like to elaborate on, Francois, if you want?
No, just to congratulate you guys on an amazing project. I know how what this kind of work is, and it's really thankless work doing the negotiations and the difficult sort of legal stuff in between. There was actually a scientific question I had, which is our work tends to be much more interventional in the health system, and you've shown these beautiful relationships. And I keep thinking about when you walk into an environment where you have limited number of interventions, what kind of things we could intervene around. One of the easiest things for us in the health system is actually around blood pressure. And you've done such fabulous work in pregnancy. Is it a linear relationship? Does every single millimeter of mercury, every centimeter or every centigrade of temperature get you the same kind of millimeters of mercury rise in blood pressure? Because intervening amongst pregnant women is one of the easiest areas generally in health systems for us to do. And it seems it's going to get the biggest bang for our buck in terms of mitigation going forward. So I've already spoken to Matthew and the team about this in the past, but there's a lot of interest in intervening in those groups as one of the earliest priority areas and going to ministries of health and trying to make them understand how important this issue is.
Maybe I can try and answer that. Thanks, Francois. The difficult questions as always. These databases, so we've collated them and we've harvested them with the weather data. In themselves, they could address many of these questions. So in the 15 cohorts that would merge in Johannesburg, you could address a question around hypertension separate from the climate question. And there's a PhD student who's looking at hypertension and heat exposure in pregnancy. And also Sherlin. I don't know if anyone else on the team wants to come in. And Daya had a question. And thanks, Daya, again. You've been a tremendous support for this process.
Thanks, Matthew. And also thank you, Daya, for your questions. These are noted. Is there anyone who would be able to answer those questions?
Yeah, and Jen's question are quite similar.
Yeah. So essentially the question is, okay, Craig. Or Daya, would you like to maybe phrase your question? Your hand is up to ask it.
Yeah, thanks, Natasha. Thanks, Matthew. And congratulations again to the team. Amazing. So refreshing to hear of these sort of data amidst all the other medical and biomedical collaterals. I just wanted to ask one question, and that in the more recent years, people have been finding that microbiome, like the vaginal microbiome, could influence preterm birth. So how are we actually looking at such confounders? Do you think that the environmental factors could have a direct or an indirect effect on the microbiome, and as a result on, for example, preterm births? Thanks.
Dr. that.
Yeah. No, I will come in on that question. Thank you so much for that question. I think something that we have been grappling with is that preterm birth is such a complicated outcome on its own, and there are so many different contributing factors. So, for example, Tatenda mentioned also investigating air quality, and then also investigating the mediating effect between heat and air quality as well. So there are lots of these contributing and confounding factors that affect the relationship between heat and preterm birth. And then, of course, these pathways in between the impacts as well that are not necessarily confounders. So the microbiome is definitely not something that we have explored as yet. We do have another project called BioHeat that is trying to investigate the biological pathways between heat and preterm birth. So we obviously have a lot of epidemiological evidence, but we just want to understand actually what are the biological factors that contribute to preterm birth. Because as Tatenda mentioned, we are seeing impacts in the short term, so immediately before preterm birth, a couple of days before preterm birth. But there is also evidence around the impacts of heat in the early parts of pregnancy on preterm birth as well. So just trying to understand what are the biological pathways and inflammatory markers, heat trap proteins, different pathways. So the microbiome is definitely an interesting one. I don't think it's something that we've looked at or thought about before, but I know there's a lot more interest in the microbiome in general. So hopefully it's something that we can look at in the future. Thanks.
Thank you, Dash and Daya. Craig, would you like to maybe have a go at answering Daya's other question?
I don't know if I can answer those questions directly, but I'm just thinking that perhaps I could just give an outline of the approach and the paper I'm currently working on for Research Project 2 in Johannesburg. And essentially what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to take the studies that have been done over the last 20 years and we've gone through a whole process of acquisition and harmonization. And then, as Matthew was saying, linkage to the climate variables and putting in all these lags. And then this paper at the moment is trying to look at if we can begin to use machine learning to begin to interrogate some of these underlying relationships using this technique called Shapley values. And then based on the most prominent Shapley values, then to begin to do some kind of dimensional reduction strategy where we start to see if there's any kind of multi-biomarker clustering. It was in relation to heat specifically. And one of the interesting things that we're finding is that there is this, as expected, elderly cluster, but what's also coming through is this HIV cluster, this prominence of HIV. And so again, it's just this kind of layering of these different layers of inequality and disease and now climate, which all seem to be showing these very interesting relationships. And I think it doesn't answer Francois' question directly about blood pressure, but blood pressure is definitely part of that mix and part of the biomarkers that we are looking at. And then the other thing I just wanted to mention is just on Sibu's slides, please, when you see the mails coming through from the heat sensor, hopefully this gives people a bit more context just around why we're asking for some of the things we're asking for. We've tried to structure it in the easiest way for people to fill in these forms. We've tried to make them into forms that you can just click online. I think sometimes that might put people off, but really we're just trying to ease the process through. Nothing is changing. Everything is staying in South Africa. We purely need to update DTA so they don't have this clause that says that the data finishes on the 30th of June. And so I just wanted to make sure that we're very transparent, and that's really what we're trying to do with those forms. There's no other intention there. And just hopefully that eases the concerns around people receiving different emails for different things.
Thanks, Craig. I see Dersh, Sibru, you both have your hand up, but we are actually slightly over time. Nick would like to maybe just briefly answer Daya's other question, and then we can come to you and to Dersh and Sibru. And then anyone who needs to drop off, we can totally understand if you need to go. And we thank you all for joining. It's been really great to have everyone on here. And we're so glad that we've got this activity amongst the data providers, that your data is being used to do some very interesting work. And again, that this will be available on the Heat Center website, and we will be emailing the link. So if you missed this part as well, you can access it later. Nick, would you please go ahead?
Sure. Yeah, I think Matthew answered some questions just around the data, but what we are hoping to do, we work with our partners in DSI, the HE2AT Open Data Science Project, and they host a metadata repository, which we contribute to, and Natasha is one of the data stewards with some of the other partners on the call. And on that website, we'll hopefully be able to say exactly which data sets have contributed to the overall data set. We can also then communicate directly with the data providers. These are the data sets that are used. And then, as Matthew mentioned in the chat, if those data sets are used in a specific paper, you'll of course be invited as per the authorship guidelines. But hopefully there will be a public facing platform as well for funders, so that you can refer your funders to this website and just give them that heads up that this data actually has had ongoing impact beyond your initial use case.
Thanks, Nick. Dersh, Sibru, if either of you would like to go. I don't remember who had their hand up first.
Nick's covered.
I think Nick has covered my response. I think the only thing to add on top of what Craig was mentioning to address some of the questions that have been raised by Francois, just in terms of also identifying populations at risk with the aim of looking at intervention. So yes, there is the look at the health data itself, but some of the earlier work that we've done around vulnerability mapping was to also from an environmental perspective to identify those areas where, individuals living in those areas would be most at risk and have an idea what are the environmental characteristics of those areas to also then think about interventions from more an environmental perspective as well, just to add on top of what Nick had already said. Not Nick, but Craig had already said. Thanks.
Okay, last hand for question, Craig.
No, sorry, that's an old hand.
So I think it's a good time to end off there. Again, thank you presenters for the excellent presentations, and thank you data providers for your data and for bearing with us during these changes that we are also going through. And I hope you all have a lovely rest of your evening. Again, just to remind you, you can contact anybody from these slides if you need to ask any questions beyond this webinar. Okay, thanks all. Bye.